Hi, I'm Evan B. Howard, today bringing a lecture on the history and forms of new monasticism. So, just what is new monasticism? Where did all this come from? Well, the answer to this question really depends on where you draw your circle. The fact of the matter is, intentional communities and new explorations of Christian life are forming and have been forming all throughout history, and they vary greatly. There are new friars, small teams of missionaries sharing Christ in deed and word among the poor of the world. There are new siblings of the common life drawing from the heritage of monasticism to form solidarity and influence. There are new solitaries experimenting with the life and experience of the hermit. Some of these expressions are single communities of Christians living in a single house. Others are just globally dispersed associations of people who commit to common values and practices and maintain relationships through social media and things like that. Today, I'm going to focus my attention primarily on Protestant groups that have been formed in the past 50 years, although I'll give a little bit of precursors to that. So that's where I'm drawing my limit, and even at that, I'm only giving you a brief sketch. There's just so much to be covered. So here goes. The historical development of new monasticism can be divided into 3 seasons. In the first season, what I'll call the first season, from 1930 to 1974, the early 70s, I think that some early seeds of change were planted. During this season, Roman Catholics were redefining the nature of religious life, both in anticipation of and in response to the Second Vatican Council. The Council urged what I would call a double-sided renewal of religious life. On the one hand, looking back to their precursors, looking back to the founders of each of their expressions, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, the Jesuits, these sorts of things, looking back at their origins, but also with a second side to viewing how they are going to enculturate, how they're going to express themselves in the culture of today. And that was just one of the pieces of fervor that was influencing the development of Protestant expressions. First, Protestant experiments in communities' life, such as Bonhoeffer's Finkenwalde community, Eberhard Arnold's Bruderhof, the Iona and the Taizé communities, Clarence Jordan's Koinonia Farm, and then a little bit later, Reba Place Fellowship, all stimulated renewal in Europe and America. Now, these communities and many more are described in Donald Blesch's Centers of Christian Renewal. That's a first book that he wrote to kind of describe 8 different communities. And then a second book he wrote that expands even more is what he calls Wellsprings of Renewal. This is a book that covers a wide range and then does a little bit of evaluation of community life in Europe and America, and among Protestants in particular. From the late 50s through the early 70s, a kind of a youth counterculture was wildly experimenting with lots of things and with new ways of being Christian. A number of intentional Christian communities sprang up in the wake of this kind of youth counterculture excitement. Groups like Church of the Redeemer in Houston, Jesus People USA in Chicago area, Bethany Fellowship, and others exhibited the gospel in new forms for a new era. These communities and others are described in Dave and Nita Jackson's Living Together in a World Falling Apart. And in the follow-up book, the book that followed that up, which is much less easy to get a hold of, called Coming Together, All Those Communities and What They're Up To. So that gives you a sense of some of the precursors to new monasticism. In the second season, from the later 1970s to somewhere around 1993, something like that, these 25 years there, or 20 years really, these early seeds were watered, and then some new kinds of seeds were planted. It was actually a season of decline for Roman Catholic religious orders and the youth counterculture. So whereas Roman Catholic religious orders and the counterculture were on the decline, there was an incline and a rise of interest in new kinds of communities. Reba Place Fellowship, which I mentioned earlier, experienced kind of a charismatic renewal and gave birth to Reba Place Church as membership swelled. A number of socially active leaders, communities, and organizations associated with what became known as the evangelical left emerged in this season, many of which became mentors and elders to some of the forms of new monasticism current today. It was from this influence that we witnessed the birth of communities like the Sojourners community in Washington, D.C., the Open Door community in Atlanta, and the Church of the Servant King, now located in Oregon, and the Church of the Sojourners in San Francisco. And all of those communities are described, and with many more as well, in a book by David Jansen known as Fire, Salt, and Peace: Intentional Christian Communities Alive in North America. Now, at the same time, there were a number of movements taking place, thoughts taking place in missiological theory. In 1974, Ralph Winter, one of the key figures in the development of Fuller Seminary's influential School of World Mission, published an article in the Journal of Missiology on the two structures of God's redemptive mission. And in this article, he distinguished what he called modalities, parish-type structures which include people of all ages, genders, and commitment levels, and sodalities, monastic or mission structures which restrict membership by commitment and often other factors. Winter began to make a call for Protestant missions to rethink themselves in conscious relation to these Catholic missionary orders. He writes, "I believe that Protestants have underestimated the Roman orders, and that after 2 centuries of extensive Protestant mission experience, it is high time to recognize these unusually committed fellowships or orders for what they are, namely a marvelous invention." Winter's influence stimulated a lively interest in forming Protestant missionary orders. One of these early pioneers of Protestant missionary orders was the New Zealander Viv Grigg, a graduate of the Fuller School of World Mission. In 1979, Grigg moved into a garbage dump, or squatter settlement, in Manila in order to bring the presence of the gospel to some of the 3 million slum dwellers there. Ultimately, Viv Grigg catalyzed a number of missionary movements among the poor in Asia. In his book, The Cry of the Urban Poor, written originally in 1984, Grigg documented his research regarding missionary efforts worldwide, concluding that, and I quote, "The greatest mission surge in history, aimed at the last frontiers, has entirely missed the greatest migration in history, the migration of rural peasants in the Third World to the great megacities." His solution to this failure of missions was a return to the historic vows and missionary orders. His passion was, and I quote again, "to thrust out groups similar to the devotional communities of 12th century preaching friars, or the wandering Irish monks that converted northern Europe between the 5th and the 9th centuries before the Catholic hierarchy gained control there. In our case, we must send communities of men and women, married couples and singles, with commitments to live as the poor among the poor in order to preach the kingdom and establish the church in these great slum areas." He speaks specifically of a recovery of the vows of non-destitute poverty, temporary celibacy, and evangelical humility. Grigg is the founder of Servants of Asia's Urban Poor, one expression of new friars movements I will mention later. Another of the early pioneers in these missionary orders was a man by the name of John Hayes. In 1983, Hayes, like Viv Grigg, moved into the center of poverty. Only for Hayes, it was the Mini Street ghetto in Los Angeles. And, like Grigg, Hayes catalyzed the formation of a number of teams which would relocate within poverty-stricken populations of the world. This was the foundation of interchange. Ultimately, interchange adopted the idea of orders for their own organization, developing an intentional integration of missional, prophetic, and contemplative currents, and adopting practices of retreats, sabbaticals, novitiates, and so on. Interchange, a Christian order among the poor, has been an influential force among the new friars, modeling a ministry of simple, loving friendship among the forgotten of the world. John Hayes' vision is communicated most clearly in his book, Submerge, Living Deep in a Shallow World. And while all this was going on, England was giving birth to still another form of Christian community. In 1977, a wild man by the name of Andy Raine introduced himself to John and Linda Skinner. They partnered with a Baptist minister by the name of Roy Searle to form what became the Northumbria community. The Northumbria community has a strong connection to Holy Island, a tidal island off the northeast coast of England, and all of the Celtic riches that come from that neighborhood. They sponsor retreats and publish books like Celtic Daily Prayer, which inside the book actually contains a brief description of the Northumbria community and how to be connected to them. And they, like the Iona community, have sought to nourish kindred spirits through a system of dispersed monasticism, wherein members commit themselves to common values and common practices, which they then share with each other through a variety of different means. So, through the first season of our history, seeds of radical living, life according to the counsels of the gospel, were planted. Through the second season, this same theme was affirmed, while new seeds, those of mission and community, were planted and then watered. In the third season, what I will call about 1994 to the present, these watered seeds have begun to sprout and new seeds are being scattered throughout the globe. While Catholic religious orders were on the decline, Protestant and ecumenical religious communities started springing up all over the place. For example, the missional communities experiment that started with Viv Grigg and John Hayes has become an entire movement of new friars, including Interchange, Servants of Asia's Urban Poor, now simply known as Servants, Servant Partners, Urban Neighbors of Hope, Word Made Flesh, and other groups. These are now often identified by the phrase New Friars, which I mentioned, and they're all described in this book, New Friars. And through these new mendicant expressions, the life and message of Christ are being spread to the most marginalized of humankind through new monastic expressions. Now, from a completely different side of things, partly as a result of all things of the Toronto Blessing and the ministry of the Toronto Blessing in England, a set of what they call 24/7 prayer houses or prayer rooms were established in London and nearby. These were places where people made a serious effort to fulfill the Moravian dream of having a round-the-clock prayer meeting. Now, while most 24/7 prayer rooms are not staffed enough to enable a full 24/7 prayer schedule, this movement has really raised up the banner of prayer, and particularly intercession prayer again. And what is most interesting for a study of new monasticism is that all these prayer centers developed and as these prayer centers developed, many of them morphed into intentional communities that were then later on called boiler rooms. They served their neighbors. People lived in geographic proximity. They ate often in common. They shared a set of common values, required a certain level of commitment, and of course, in a 24/7 prayer house, they had times of common prayer. Their story is narrated in a book entitled Punk Monk, of all things. And North American expressions of this particular movement, along with some other expressions of new monasticism, have more recently become the subject of a book-length academic review published by Oxford entitled New Monasticism and the Transformation of American Evangelicalism. Another British movement is the Fresh Expressions movement. In light of the nexus of both rapid decline and charismatic renewal and some other factors all mixed in, some in the Church of England considered how they might encourage the life and growth of the Church. The child of this discourse was the Fresh Expressions movement. This movement formally began in England in 2004 through a report of the Church of England about the state of the Church in that nation and the need for a new direction. The word fresh expression is actually taken from the Book of Common Prayer. Quote, "The Church of England professes the faith uniquely revealed in the Holy Scriptures and set forth in the Catholic creeds, which faith the Church is called upon to proclaim afresh in each generation." The report was entitled Mission-Shaped Ministry. Those who helped draft the report note that the original title was Dying to Live, but the later title was thought to be too dire and too inflammatory. The conclusion of the report coincided with the beginning of a new ministry, that of Archbishop Rowan Williams. Rowan Williams supported this movement with both energy and monies. The impact for this new expression of religious life has been significant indeed. Communities like Moot, the Order of Mission, the Order of Saints Hilda and Aidan and Hilda, St. Anselm's community, and many others have been birthed with some connection to this Fresh Expressions movement. And many of these expressions are described in the book New Monasticism as fresh expression of church. But perhaps most visible to some has been the establishment and networking of Christian activist communities in the United States. Perhaps this story has its beginning in a student protest of a forced removal of a group of homeless folk in Philadelphia in September of 1995. Shane Claiborne, a student of Anthony Campolo at Eastern Baptist College, and one of the participants in that protest, found his developing solidarity with the homeless community a new lease on Christian faith. After a stint in Calcutta, volunteering with Mother Teresa and another at Willow Creek Church, one of the largest megachurches in the United States, Shane returned to the slums of Philadelphia to found, with others, the Simple Way community, one of the most influential of these young new monastic communities. Shane and company have been involved in all sorts of creative activism, and since 1997 have drawn similar-minded communities together in a regular, what they called, family reunion. Now, in 1998, philosopher Jonathan R. Wilson published a book evaluating the impact of Alistair MacIntyre's After Virtue for the Church. In the last chapter of this book, Jonathan Wilson evaluated MacIntyre's famous call for a new Benedict. Wilson, however, longed not for a new Saint Benedict, but, he said, for Christian communities that may produce a new Saint Benedict. He called the development of these communities, using his own phrase here, a new monasticism. He looked for the formation of communities of Christians characterized by a sense of God's purpose of the healing of the world's fragmentation, by its offer of life for the whole people of God, by spiritual disciplines, and by deep theological reflection. Now, another student of Campolo's and a friend of Shane Claiborne's was Jonathan Hartgrove. Jonathan Hartgrove began visiting the Simple Way community with his friend Leah Wilson, who happened to be philosopher Jonathan Wilson's daughter, in 1999. They joined forces. Jonathan Wilson and Jonathan Hartgrove and Leah were married, hence Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove. And in 2003, Jonathan and Shane traveled to Iraq with the Christian peacemaker teams to embody a ministry of presence amidst the violence of the invasion of Baghdad. Having experienced a powerful example of hospitality by the Iraqi people in a town called Rutbah, upon returning to the States, Jonathan and Leah founded the Rutbah House community in Durham, North Carolina, a house of hospitality and reconciliation in the midst of a low-income neighborhood. The network of communities was growing. In 2004, Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove and the Rutbah House received a grant to draw some of these kindred spirits of intentional communities together for a gathering to help discern the shape of a new monasticism. The shape they found was later published in the influential Schools for Conversion, 12 Marks of a New Monasticism. And the movement has grown since then. One final network that has grown somewhat out of the relationship with Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove is the mainline missional monastic movement spearheaded by Elaine Heath. Elaine was a professor of evangelism and missions at Perkins and developed a way of integrating John Wesley, historic monastic interests, and contemporary new monastic ideals along the lines of the 12 Marks variety. Elaine and Jonathan knew each other. The result was a book entitled Longing for Spring, and then was later followed up with Missional Monastic Mainline, written with Larry Duggins. Larry, Elaine, and others also developed what they called an Academy for Missional Wisdom, a group that trains people in how to think missionally and even to plant new missional communities. So there you have it. This is only a brief sketch of what is going on. I have not even begun to describe creative developments in Catholic religious life, the new monastic expressions being developed and birthed in the vineyard, new experiments in Dominican life, Karen Sloan's flirting with monasticism, and the growth of ecumenical solitaries, nourished by the newsletter Raven's Bread. I could speak of groups in Sweden and Germany and Korea and on and on. I remember watching a little bit of a decline of interest in one branch of this vast movement and thinking, after having only had a small measure of encounter and involvement with this group, that I had missed it all. New monasticism had come and gone, and I was only able to shake their hands along the way. I could not have been more wrong. True, some expressions have seen gains and losses in both interest and in numbers of people involved. But where individual expressions have fluctuated, the interest in new forms of religious life on the whole has simply blossomed. A number of years ago, I was sitting right here on the bench in front of of this building, which is our little guest house that we call the Hermit Hut. And I was doing devotions. This was before I had built the cell. And I was sitting out here doing devotions and then looking out across the canyon into the hill on the other side. And at that point in time on the hill, it was covered with dead trees. We have now since used most of them for firewood, but the hill was covered with a lot of dead trees. We had had an Ips beetle infestation, and the trees were plagued with this, and they had all died, or at least most of them. The pinyon trees had died. And I was thinking of how sad I was that we had gotten this property and moved in, and then only to watch a lot of the trees die. And I was sad about that. And as I was sitting here and it was my quiet time, I was reminded of the kind of the Western Church. And I was grieving, watching the withering of things and the drying up of so much expression of church that I had seen and God's work. And I was sad. And then a few days later, I was walking along the property, and I noticed down near the ground, I noticed a little pinyon tree, maybe this kind of big, hidden away in a corner. And I thought, I'd seen all this death, and now there was a little sprig of brand new life. And I was reminded of some groups like Interchange, groups like Urban Neighbors of Hope. I thought, maybe there's the chance for growth. And over the years, I've watched more and more of these new baby trees. And I think 100 years from now, we may have another full forest. And with groups like Fresh Expressions, with groups like New Monasticisms, with groups like Boiler Rooms and Northumbrias, we may have a whole new forest here. I'm looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to fresh expressions of new religious life, spreading throughout the globe in a time when the church needs some new expressions. And I hope you find your own new expression. And perhaps through that, we can find all things becoming new.